Karen Whitmore considered herself a good neighbor, a watchful one. Not nosy, of course, just aware. Every afternoon, she sat by her front window with a tall glass of iced tea, eyes flicking up from her phone every so often, scanning the street out of habit. She knew the rhythm of her neighborhood, who came and went, which cars belonged, which faces were familiar. It was a peaceful, well-maintained community, the kind where nothing unexpected ever happened. Until today, the first thing that caught her attention was the slow roll of a gray SUV turning onto her street. Nothing unusual about that. People visited all the time. But this car wasn't pulling into a driveway for a quick stop. It wasn't circling back like someone lost. It moved deliberately, finally easing into the driveway of the Johnsons' old house, 3 doors down from Karen's. Karen's grip tightened around her glass. That house had been empty for months. She leaned forward, watching as the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe mid-30s, dressed casually in jeans and a navy sweater. No uniform, no clipboard, no delivery van following behind. He moved with a certain confidence, not the hesitant shuffle of someone unfamiliar with the property. Karen's heart ticked up a beat. She told herself she wasn't jumping to conclusions, that this had nothing to do with the fact that he was black. But something fell off. She kept watching as he walked around to the back of his SUV, popped the trunk, and pulled out 2 medium-sized boxes. Not heavy. He carried them with ease. No struggle, no rush. She squinted. Moving boxes? But there was no moving truck, no second car, no family members or friends helping him unload. Then he did something that made Karen sit up even straighter. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a key, and slid it smoothly into the front door's lock. Karen's pulse quickened. A key? How did he have a key? As far as she knew, no one had purchased the house yet. The Johnsons had moved out 6 months ago, and though there had been a for sale sign for a while, it had been taken down weeks ago. Had the house been sold? Had she missed something? She stared at the man as he stepped inside, holding the door open just long enough to carry the boxes in with him. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen. She could call someone. Maybe he was with the realtor. Maybe he was a contractor sent to do some work inside. But something about this didn't sit right. Her neighborhood was safe, peaceful, and she intended to keep it that way. Her thumb tapped, open her recent calls. 911. She hesitated. This wasn't about race. This was about security, wasn't it? Karen took a deep breath and pressed the call button. Karen's thumb hovered over the screen of her phone. Her mind raced. Who was this man? Why did he have a key? How could he just walk into that house like he belonged there? She tried to reason with herself. Maybe the house had been sold, and she simply hadn't heard about it. Maybe he was a contractor sent in for renovations. But there had been no for sale sign in weeks, no indication that new owners were moving in. And something about the way he carried himself, so calm, so certain, made her uneasy. What if he wasn't supposed to be there? What if he was squatting? Her breath quickened as she imagined the possibilities. What if he was a thief, sneaking in under the guise of a homeowner? What if he was stripping the place, taking appliances, copper wiring, anything he could sell? If she didn't call, and something happened, if crime started creeping into their safe, peaceful neighborhood, how would she live with herself? She tapped 911 and brought the phone to her ear. 911, what's your emergency? Karen inhaled sharply. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person in my neighborhood. The dispatcher's voice remained steady. Can you describe the individual? Karen hesitated for half a second, then forced the words out. Black male, medium build. He parked a gray SUV in the driveway and used a key to go inside. The dispatcher was quiet for a moment. So he used a key? Yes, Karen said quickly, gripping the phone tighter. But the house has been empty for months. I don't know if he's supposed to have it. The dispatcher took down her name, location, and a few more details before responding. We'll send an officer to check it out. Karen exhaled, her heart still pounding as she hung up. She had done the right thing. She wasn't accusing the man of anything. She was just making sure everything was in order. That was what good neighbors did, wasn't it? She sat back in her chair, arms crossed tightly, her eyes locked on the house. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, until the distant wail of sirens broke the silence. A police cruiser rolled up to the house, stopping just behind the SUV. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting near their belts, scanning the property. Karen leaned forward, barely breathing. The front door of the house swung open. The man stepped out, his expression shifting from calm to confused as soon as he saw the officers. He frowned, his body tensing slightly as they approached. Karen couldn't hear the words being exchanged, but she could see everything. The way the officers stood rigid, the way one of them gestured toward the car, then the house. The man slowly raised his hands, palms up, as if to show he meant no harm. His lips moved, and Karen could imagine him asking, "What's going on?" One officer said something that made the man's brows furrow deeper. He reached into his back pocket. Karen's breath caught in her throat. Was he pulling out a weapon? Her grip tightened around her iced tea, her stomach twisting in nervous anticipation. But no, it wasn't a gun. It was a set of papers. He held them up for the officers to see. One of them took the documents, flipping through them with a trained eye. Then just like that, the energy shifted. The officers relaxed. The man gestured toward the house, and one of the officers gave him a small nod before handing the papers back. They spoke for a few more seconds, then started heading back to the cruiser. Karen's mouth went dry. They weren't arresting him. They weren't even questioning him anymore. Instead, they were walking away like nothing had happened, like she had made a mistake. Karen sat frozen in her chair, her iced tea sweating in her grip. The police weren't arresting him. They weren't even detaining him for questioning. Instead, they handed back his papers, exchanged a few more words, and then, just like that, they turned away, heading back to their cruiser. Her stomach twisted. Something was wrong. They weren't supposed to just leave. They were supposed to do something. At the very least, they should have looked deeper into why this man had access to the house. Because surely, he wasn't supposed to be there. And yet, the way the officers moved, the way their body language shifted, told her otherwise. Karen couldn't take it anymore. She stood abruptly, pushing open her front door, stepping out onto her porch as if she were simply checking her mailbox. But her eyes were locked on the scene across the street. She took a few steps closer, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Excuse me," one of the officers, a middle-aged man with a graying buzz cut, turned back toward her. His expression was neutral, unreadable. "Ma'am," Karen forced a polite smile, though her heart pounded. "What's going on? I'm the one who called. I saw this man enter the house, and I was concerned. The property's been vacant for months." The officer exhaled, exchanging a glance with his partner before looking back at her. "Ma'am, this is Mr. Ellington. He's the new owner of the house. He moved in today." Karen blinked. Her lips parted, but no words came out. "New owner?" Her gaze snapped to the man standing beside the officers. He stood with his arms crossed, watching her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, dark and steady, held something sharp beneath the surface. He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Yeah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I live here." Karen felt a prickle at the base of her neck. This wasn't possible, was it? But then she saw the papers in his hand, the ones he had shown the officers. The title, the mortgage agreement, his driver's license. Everything was in order. He really did own the house. The air between them thickened. Karen squared her shoulders, folding her arms across her chest. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she said, her voice tight. Marcus let out a dry laugh. "No," he said smoothly. "You assumed I didn't belong." Her jaw tightened. "That's not what I said." "You didn't have to," Marcus replied, his voice cutting through the space between them like a knife. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his weight moving from one foot to the other. "Like I said," he interjected, "this was just a misunderstanding." His eyes flickered to Karen, his expression unreadable. "But going forward, ma'am, if you have concerns, I'd suggest speaking to your neighbors before calling us." A warning. Karen's face burned. She turned back to Marcus, searching for something in his face, some sign of smugness, of triumph. But there was none, just quiet, controlled awareness. He knew exactly what had happened here, and so did she. Karen barely slept that night. Even after the officers left, after Marcus walked back inside his house without another word, A gnawing unease settled in her chest. She told herself she had done the right thing, that calling the police had been about safety, not suspicion. But the way Marcus had looked at her, that knowing, steady gaze, left her feeling exposed in a way she couldn't quite explain. She spent most of the night tossing and turning, replaying the scene in her head. The way the officers had walked away. The way Marcus had called her out so plainly. By morning, the feeling hadn't faded. Karen stood at her kitchen window, coffee in hand, peering through the blinds toward Marcus's house. She expected to see him leaving for work, driving away, disappearing from sight. Instead, he was standing in his driveway, and he was looking directly at her. Karen's breath caught. Had he been waiting for her to check? She jerked back from the window, so fast she nearly spilled her coffee. Maybe this was just some intimidation tactic. Maybe he wanted her to feel uncomfortable. Fine. If he thought he could make her nervous, he was wrong. She had nothing to hide. But then, the worst possible thing happened. Marcus walked up her driveway. Karen's pulse pounded. Her first instinct was to pretend she wasn't home, but she knew that wouldn't work. He had seen her. He knew she was there. The doorbell rang, once then twice. She hesitated for a second before forcing herself to move, gripping the doorknob tightly before pulling it open just enough to face him. Yes. Marcus stood on her porch, phone in hand, resting casually against his hip. "Morning," he said, his voice almost too even. "Thought I'd return the favor. You seem real interested in watching me, so I figured I'd stop by and say hi." Karen kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." Marcus smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "See," he said slowly, "I've got cameras. Not just the doorbell kind. Full security system. Installed them before I even moved in." Karen felt her stomach twist. Marcus lifted his phone, tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward her. The footage played. Karen saw herself walking past his house multiple times, pausing, slowing down, peering toward the driveway, coming back in the evenings, her head tilting slightly as if trying to see inside. There was no mistaking it. The timestamps in the corner of each clip made it undeniable. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You called the cops on me," he said, his voice quieter now, sharper. "But I've got days of footage of you lurking around my house before I even moved in." Karen's throat went dry. I was just taking my usual walk," she said, but the words felt weak even as she spoke them. Marcus let out a short breath, shaking his head. "Right. Because most people take their usual walk past the same house at the same time every single day." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Marcus studied her, then pocketed his phone. "See, I wasn't sure what her deal was at first," he said. "But then I looked back through my footage. I saw the way you kept looking at the house. Like you were waiting for something." Karen's heart pounded. "That's ridiculous." "Maybe," Marcus said, taking a slow step closer. "But see, I did a little digging. Found out this house sat empty for months. Yet somehow, people around here already knew it was spoken for." Karen's lips parted, but Marcus continued before she could speak. "Funny thing is," he said, voice even, "I was the only one who put in an offer. No one else. No counterbids. Just me." His eyes locked onto hers. "And yet," he said, voice quieter now, "my realtor told me later that there was some neighborhood chatter. That some people expected someone else to move in." The silence between them stretched. Karen could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. He wasn't guessing anymore. He knew. And if he had figured all this out already, what else did he know? Karen swallowed hard and shut the door. Karen spent the rest of the day in a haze, her mind racing with everything Marcus had said. She had shut the door on him, hoping to end the conversation, but deep down, she knew that wasn't the end of it. He wasn't going to just let this go. And sure enough, by the next morning, her worst fears were realized. She knew something was wrong the moment she opened her phone. Her neighborhood group chat, usually filled with messages about HOA meetings and complaints about teenagers playing loud music, was different today. The notifications came in rapid bursts, but instead of the usual chatter, the messages had an edge to them. Then she saw it. A video. Karen's breath caught as she clicked play. The footage was from Marcus's security cameras, stitched together in a short but damning compilation. It showed her, walking past his house again and again, lingering, looking. The timestamps were clear, proving that she had been watching the house for days before he ever moved in. Then, at the end of the video, Marcus himself appeared. "This is what I saw before I even moved in," he said, his tone level but sharp. "And then, the moment I stepped onto my own property, cops showed up. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't breaking in. I was just a black man moving into his own home." The video cut out. Karen's hand shook as she scrolled through the comments. People were talking. Some were outraged. Some were shocked. And some already knew. She stumbled back from the counter, gripping the edge for balance. A sharp knock at the door made her jump. When she opened it, Linda, her next-door neighbor, stood there, clutching her phone like it had personally betrayed her. Her expression was tight, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "Did you see this?" she asked in a hushed voice, as if speaking it out loud would make it worse. Karen forced a breath. "See what?" Linda hesitated, then turned her phone around. The video played again, right there in Karen's face. Karen swallowed hard. "Where did he post this?" Linda exhaled through her nose. "Everywhere. Facebook, Instagram, even the neighborhood group." Her voice nearly cracked. "Karen, what is this?" Karen pressed her lips together. "It's taken out of context." Linda gave her a look that made Karen's stomach twist. "I was looking out for the neighborhood," Karen insisted, her voice sharper now. "If I saw someone suspicious, I had every right to call the police." Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed. "But he wasn't suspicious. He was just moving in." Karen felt her throat tighten. "So now I'm the bad guy?" Linda didn't answer right away. She just glanced at her phone again, then back at Karen. "People are talking," she said carefully. Karen bristled. "People talk about everything." Linda shifted uncomfortably. "Judy already commented." Karen's stomach dropped. "She's trying to do damage control," Linda added hesitantly. "But this isn't going away." Karen didn't respond. She just shut the door. By the afternoon, she realized just how right Linda was. At the grocery store, she went early, hoping to avoid most of the neighborhood crowd. But even in the quiet aisles, she felt it. The eyes, the stolen glances, the quick whispers. She turned a corner and nearly ran into Bethany Moore from 3 streets over. Bethany's face tensed, but she forced a polite smile. "Oh," she said. "Hey, Karen." Karen replied, gripping the handle of her cart a little too tightly. She waited for Bethany to start a conversation, to say something else, anything to make things feel normal. But after a brief, awkward pause, Bethany just nodded and walked away. Karen stood there, her face burning. And then, that evening, came the phone call that nearly knocked the breath out of her. Her son's name flashed across the screen. "Andrew." She answered immediately, pressing the phone to her ear. "Andrew, sweetheart, what the hell did you do?" Karen flinched at the sharpness in his voice. "What are you talking about?" Andrew let out a harsh sigh. "I got a call from a colleague today. Someone I work with. He saw the video, Mom." Karen's stomach twisted. "That video is taken completely out of context." "Context?" Andrew let out a humorless laugh. "Mom, you called the cops on a guy for moving into his own house. And now it's everywhere. People are talking about it in my office. My boss saw it." Karen's hands trembled. I didn't mean..." "You didn't mean for it to blow up," Andrew cut in. "But you meant every part of what you did." Karen's throat tightened. "That's not fair." Andrew was silent for a moment, then sighed again, softer this time. "You know what's funny?" he said bitterly. "I never saw you as that kind of person. Controlling? Sure. Stubborn? Absolutely. But now I have to sit in a break room and listen to people talk about my mother like she's some racist caricature." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Andrew's voice dropped. "Just don't call me for a while, okay?" The line went dead. Karen stared at the phone in her hand, an empty, sinking feeling in her chest. For the first time, she felt something close to shame. Karen barely left her house for the next 2 days. She told herself it was because she didn't want to deal with the gossip, that it would all blow over soon. People in the neighborhood always found something new to talk about. But deep down, she knew this was different. This wasn't just idle gossip. This wasn't a minor embarrassment that would fade with time. This was her being exposed for exactly what she had done. She could feel the shift in the air. The first sign came at the grocery store, when neighbors who once waved or made small talk now glanced away when they saw her. Conversations that used a pause to include her now carried on as if she wasn't even there. The second sign came in a neighborhood group chat. She hadn't been officially removed, but the silence was loud. No one responded to her messages. No one acknowledged her posts. Discussions went on as if she didn't exist. But the real moment of reckoning came at the next HOA meeting. Karen almost didn't go. She knew people were talking. She knew Marcus had posted that video. She knew her name was on the lips of nearly everyone in the community. But skipping the meeting would look like guilt, and she refused to give anyone the satisfaction of thinking she had something to be ashamed of. So she went. She sat in her usual seat, back straight, hands folded in her lap, pretending not to notice the way people shifted in their chairs, avoiding looking directly at her. Judy, the HOA president, stood at the podium, rattling off the usual updates: landscaping schedules, upcoming community events, budget reports. But then came the open floor discussion, and Marcus stood up. Karen felt her stomach drop. "Since I'm new here," Marcus began, his voice calm, "I just want to make sure I understand how things work in this neighborhood." Judy smiled tightly. "Of course. We're all about keeping communication open." "Good to know," Marcus said. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen. "Because I was curious, how does the HOA handle situations where a homeowner is harassed by their neighbors before they even move in?" A murmur rippled through the room. Judy's smile twitched. I'm not sure what you mean." Marcus nodded, then turned his phone around so the room could see the screen. "I think you do." Karen's pulse pounded as the video played. The same footage, the same proof. Her walking past his house, lingering, watching, and then, at the end, Marcus himself speaking to the camera. The room was silent. Someone coughed. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus put his phone away. "So what's the policy on that?" Judy cleared her throat, her eyes flicking toward Karen. I think we should take this discussion offline." "Oh, I'm good having it here," Marcus said smoothly. "Unless, of course, it's an uncomfortable topic." More whispers. A few quiet agreements. Karen's face burned. She realized something in that moment. Marcus hadn't come here just to expose her. He had come here to make sure everyone saw themselves, too, because she wasn't the only one who had wanted him out. But now, no one wanted to be the one standing next to her. She could feel it, the slow, quiet way people were stepping back, distancing themselves. And for the first time in her life, Karen was the one who didn't belong. By the following week, it was clear that the fallout wasn't just social. The real consequences came when news of Marcus's video spread beyond the neighborhood. Local media picked up the story. They framed Marcus as a symbol of resilience against exclusionary housing practices, drawing attention to the quiet, unspoken rules that had shaped the community for years. People outside the neighborhood started watching. They started asking questions. And suddenly, the community that prided itself on being exclusive was under scrutiny. Houses weren't selling as fast. The HOA was fielding questions about how home sales had been handled in the past. Karen had spent years trying to keep things the same, and all she had done was make sure everything changed. One evening, she sat alone in her front yard, staring at the house she had tried so hard to keep vacant. Marcus was outside, laughing with his sister as they carried in groceries. At one point, he glanced toward her house. Their eyes met. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just gave her a single, slow nod. Not out of kindness, but acknowledgement. Karen looked away first. She had lost, and deep down, she knew she had deserved to. Karen sat alone on her porch, staring at the house across the street. The house she had once thought didn't belong to him. The house that, in her mind, was never meant for someone like Marcus. But it was his, and she had lost everything trying to prove otherwise. The neighborhood had moved on without her. People she once considered friends now avoided her. Conversations she used to be a part of happened without her. She wasn't kicked out of the community, not officially. But it didn't have to be official for her to know she was no longer welcome. Her entire world had changed in the span of days. Her reputation, her standing, even her own son's respect, gone. And for what? Marcus had never retaliated. He hadn't tried to ruin her life or seek revenge. He had simply held up a mirror and forced everyone to look at the truth. Karen used to believe that prejudice was something obvious, something loud, something that only belonged to people who openly admitted to it. But now she knew better. It didn't always look like hatred. Sometimes it looked like concern, like protection, like keeping things the way they were meant to be. But in the end, none of those things could hide the truth, because the truth always had a way of coming out. Across the street, Marcus stepped onto his porch, his phone in one hand, keys in the other. He paused for a moment, looking in her direction. Their eyes met. He didn't say anything. He didn't smirk or gloat. He didn't need to. He just gave her a single, slow nod. Not out of kindness, but acknowledgement. And Karen, for the first time, had nothing to say. If she had learned anything from this, it was this: you don't get to control the world around you through prejudice. Because no matter how much you try to twist the truth always finds its way out. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.